Hello, and thank you for watching this conversation as part of National Sawdust Masterclass series, resulting from EnactLab's mentorship conversations with composer and performer Molly Joyce, a Tolman Fellow. My name is Gregg Mozgala. I will be the moderator for this conversation. I'm an actor and the founding artistic director of The Apothete, a theater company dedicated to the production of works that explore and illuminate the disabled experience. I am also the Director of Inclusion at Queen's Theater here in New York City. I'll give a brief audio description of myself. I'm a white male with dark brown hair. I'm currently wearing a black shirt and gray pants. Behind me is a window with sun coming through it and some plants hanging from that window. I also identify as disabled. I was born with cerebral palsy. We're very excited to bring this conversation to you today with this exciting group of panelists. Before we jump into that, however, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, which I will read now. We are broadcasting from the occupied and unceded territory of the Canarsie and Mercy Lenape people, who have stewarded this land for generations. Please join us in acknowledging the Canarsie and Munsee Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. National Sawdust also acknowledges our country was founded on exclusions and erasures of many indigenous and enslaved peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and genocide. Thank you. I'd also like to add that I am calling today from Manhattan, which is on the unceded territory of the Lenape people. All right, let's get started. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. Let's start with Molly Joyce. Molly, please introduce us. Introduce yourself. Thanks.
I'll get around to that later. Thank you, Greg. I'm Molly Joyce. I'm a composer and performer. I am a white, light-skinned female with blue eyes and shorter brown hair. Today I'm wearing a kind of dark, almost black-like shirt. I am in a room with light brown walls behind me and some of my keyboards to the left of me. And I'm calling in today from the lands of the Wappinger, Paugussett, and Pequannock tribes, also known as Fairfield, Connecticut. Really excited to be here.
Thank you, Molly. Daniel, welcome.
Thanks so much. My name is Daniel. I'm a filmmaker and the head of arts and culture projects for EnactLab. EnactLab is a lab for change based in Copenhagen, but working internationally. We work at the intersection of lived experience, scientific research, arts and culture, and community engagement. I'm calling today from the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, also known as Colorado. I'm a white male with short, light brown hair, wearing a green shirt and green eyes, and sitting in a relatively nondescript white-walled room. So, looking forward.
Thank you, Daniel. Jakob, welcome.
My name is Jacob. I am the co-founder and head of communication in EnactLab. I am also an artist and activist, and I work with humanity and disability. I am an expert for Korea. I have short hair, and I am sitting in a room with white wall and green part in my bag. So thank you, and I am here in Copenhagen.
Thank you very much. Christian, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Christian Martini. I am a cognitive scientist, and then I'm co-founder and head of research at EnactLab. I'm calling here from Copenhagen. I'm a white male with dark hair and brown eyes. I have a black t-shirt on, black pants, and then I'm sitting in my kitchen with a cupboard and some kitchen tonsils in the background. Yeah, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everybody. Before we jump into the questions and the conversation, I was wondering, Molly, if you could provide a quick background on the work you've been developing, the mentorship program, and the key questions you've been exploring, so that can lead us into the discussion.
Sure, and of course, I'm ever so thankful for this opportunity from the Tolman Foundation and also National Sawdust and NYU Center for Ballet and the Arts. With this work is specifically kind of a dance collaboration, or started with that. So I was super excited to collaborate with my frequent collaborator, the disabled dancer, Jaron Herman. And between us two, we kind of have an interesting body setup, if you will, and that we both have can have parallel impaired left sides. So Jaron through congenital disability, through cerebral palsy, and mine acquired through a car accident. So we always try to explore that kind of shared terrain, yet through different sources in our works. And with this one, it's titled Left and Right. I really wanted to dive into, and I get this was Jaron's idea about a year ago, or to dive into it more, how the left has this kind of mythical and legendary, whatever societal view of kind of being negative or bad or dirty. I believe left in Latin even translates to sinister. And of course, there's so much on left-handedness out there. So I wanted to kind of dive into these kind of mythical stories a little more and have that inform the work. And also open this opportunity up to really include access as much as possible from the start. And by access and accessibility, I mean having kind of multiple sensory outputs and interpretations possible of the work. So not just zeroing in on the visual of the dance or the oral output of the music, but really having multiple options within one work. So we involved an audio describer, Max Grayson, from the start as kind of a core creative collaborator, and also the director, Austin Reagan, to help shape things near the end. So I'd say like some of my key questions exploring here is how to, and I think what EnactLab does so much, but translating from kind of lived, very personal experience, especially with Jaron and I, and translating that out into a more almost universal or maybe abstract format, and also trying to incorporate access as kind of artistically necessary as possible. Like I feel like, of course, I'm biased, but when I look at how the work is, I don't feel like it can be complete without the sign language interpreter or the open captions. I feel like it would be missing something, and how to make that even more and more necessary.
Thanks, Molly. That's fantastic. And on that point, I mean, in terms of disability and access, which are key themes of this particular conversation, you speak about how you use disability as a creative force in your work. I think this is a fairly radical idea for a vast majority of people. Often when we speak of work at the intersection of disability and arts and culture, the focus of these conversations is purely on accessibility and not the artistry. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we can expand conceptions of accessibility to create deeper, more enriching artistic processes and experiences for all.
Yeah, I feel like I want to get back to you in a week or something.
Sure.
I think
the whole conversation could be on that, but yeah.
I think just the phrase disability as a creative, well, I think when I first started getting into disability studies more in graduate school and reading about disability as a kind of socially constructed phenomenon and learning about other disabled artists, I was always more interested in, and still to this day, like new creative work, really grounded in the disabled experience. Not necessarily, especially within musical contexts, like disabled musicians still performing these kind of standard repertoire works and still ultimately compared back to what I consider this kind of false standard of what normal or able should be. So I've always been interested in the creativity of it. And I think in general in my work, I love just contradictions in a way, or something that makes you think in a way, or that you don't expect, either on the kind of musical or whatever conceptual level. And I think with incorporating accessibility more, I mean, this is something I know I'll never master accessibility in the best way possible. Like, I feel like there's always more to learn, more to improve upon, more to experiment with, especially with feedback from direct users. But for me, that's like equally exciting in a way. Like, I don't think I ever want to master my art form. I don't think I ever want to feel like I've made it or know it all. And I would say just trying to prioritize it from the start, at least it's helped me, especially in this project, like knowing it's going to have ASL, involving audio describer from the beginning. so that if you take it away, again, the work feels like it's missing something. And I love that, just kind of pushing it more and more to this multi-sensorial output. I think it's very exciting and a really natural way to collaborate with others from, especially within artistic disciplines.
Thanks. I love that. There's a lot of conversations around disability aesthetic, and I think I'm trying to figure out personally what that is, and I think the need to define that is something that we're still searching for, but that's going to happen through this engagement where we're trying to merge those two seemingly incongruous things, right? So I find that very, very exciting. And I know everyone on this call is sort of interested in that kind of merger, those tensions, those contradictions. So thanks. Jakob, I was curious, moving to you, I have a question. It was mentioned that Enact Lab is a lab for change, but I know you have articulated that you believe that the big systemic and societal changes that are necessary won't happen if we keep organizing ourselves only within isolated groups and communities, people with disabilities, gender, race, etc. It seems by keeping these things separate or siloed in this way, it doesn't acknowledge the incredible intersectionality of deaf and disabled communities. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we might design work with multiple forms and formats, and to expand the ways in which we can more deeply engage communities in which we work and have more meaningful impact. It's a large question.
It's very hard question, but I will try to answer that. And I forgot I have also got some policy I use it. And that is my point. I'm first and foremost think of communication. I'm first and foremost an activist and acting and therefore I'm also a person with disability. But I think there is a tipping point. I know when you haven't got a voice in society, it's important to group into groups and make your voices. You have seen it with all minorities, black people, brown people, disabled, but there is a tipping point when there is not it isn't good to keep your income because I think if you want true inclusion, you have to get out of your group and into a bigger group. And I think people with disability tend to forget sometimes that we are a lot of minorities in the world and we can share a lot of knowledge and we can share a lot of experience with each other. And then we have a bigger voice, and I think it's important to recognize that completely ordinary white people also have feeling of high time or hardship in the life, and I think to me having a disability is like to have a magnifier glass who enlarge the feelings of all of people. And that is my part basically, and maybe Christian Martin can bring on that.
I think you made it very clear, Jakob. I think that it's a strong point. So yeah, I think it's good.
Christian, just for the sake of the recording, for people who may be experiencing this and don't have necessarily exposure experience with Jakob's speech pattern, would you mind just taking a few moments to sort of recap as you say, the fine and concise point that he just made?
Yeah, sure. I think actually maybe the first point, which is very interesting point, and many people don't know this, that actually when you're born with a congenital speech impediment with cerebral palsy like Jakob, actually the voice that Jakob hears is fluent, completely fluent in his own monologue in his head, which actually makes a very interesting question of like, where is the experience of disability coming from? That's just a point for actually voice and being heard, that actually Jakob has a fluent experience of his own voice, and we hear it in staccato. Nonetheless, what Jakob was trying to say was this, that it's always, how do we group these sort of say, or how do we create a grouping of ourselves? As Jakob says, he's first and foremost a head of communication. He's first and foremost an activist. And then he also lives with a disability. So where should he be grouped? In communication, in activism, in disability? There's many ways we can group. And that's a question, of course, for all of us to figure out. And then Jakob's point is, but all of us also, we find ourselves in smaller and larger groups at the same time. So also, as Jakob says, white people, white males like me, we also have problems. We can also be grouped in minority issues or problems, but nonetheless, when you live with a disability, like Jakob does, it's a magnifier for many experiences that maybe I don't have to the same extent Jakob experiences in a large magnifying way. So that was some of the points that Jakob was trying to make.
Thank you very much. Both of you, Molly and Jakob, you raised an interesting point, which is, I'd just be curious to hear from both of you how you navigate, right, the, let's say, for lack of a better term, activism, right, the activism side of things, when there is such great need, right, for more visibility, more participation, more inclusion in this regard, and your art. Like many people in our position feel like they have to wear multiple hats, right, and do that. So I'd just be curious to hear from both of you how you found or not found yet how to navigate those two things. Molly, why don't we start with you and then we'll go there.
Yeah, I feel like it's a constantly evolving thing. Can I take all my answers next week and give it a week to think about? But I do think more, I think especially once I finished graduate school and was really big on disability studies, or felt like I just came out as disabled. I guess I felt like I initially had to separate them more, or I was interested in pursuing more nonprofit work related to disability, and then kind of my artistry, just two separate lanes. And then I realized that I think I should really more double down on the artistry, like to create great work that really then has that impact of hopefully activism as well. And I feel like I actually have to give huge credit here to the kind of famed writer and activist Tom Shakespeare from the UK. I think he told me like anyone can run a board meeting, but no one can do the art you're doing, kind of, or just to really double down on what's unique to you. And so that's, I think, helped whatever propel me in recent years.
Fantastic, thank you. Jakob.
It's hard because on the one hand, I feel a responsibility because I have a voice in the public eye. So yeah, I feel a responsibility to use my voice to raise awareness, but I also think, and it goes from both for Molly and you that it's very hard if all your actions become political. It's hard to be an activist because all your action in life is becoming political. So for me, it's important to say sometimes an activist and I use art to raise awareness, and sometimes I'm got me and father who is tired and so it's important to be both an activist and get angry and fighting for a bigger cause, but also got to be a normal guy. I think that is in fact important when you are angry and when you have a disability.
Thank you, Jakob. And Christian, if you would be so kind.
Yeah, sure. So Jakob just saying that it's difficult because he's both and at the same time. So of course he's both an activist, but he's also Jakob as a father. And what he's trying to say is that you need to stand the trenches and fight the fight, but not everything can always be political. And then also finding a space for art in that is that sometimes Jakob is a father, but also an artist, and sometimes he's an artist with a political and activist agenda. So it's having these hats and trying to navigate is what Jakob is trying to do.
Right. What we're talking about is having the choice, I think, right? Whether to present that and how overt, right, that activism side of things might be in our work or otherwise. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Christian, I have a question. My next question is for you. I love that you describe your work as a cognitive scientist as being in the space where cognitive science, which includes philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, meets technology, practice, and art. Again, a potentially radical concept and approach for most people. I guess I have two questions for you. The first would be, how can we develop creative processes which integrate artistic practice, academic research, and lived experience? And how might these integrative processes give life to more nuanced work and social narrative, which can expand perceptions and drive change at multiple levels, from the individual to the institutional to society at large? So again, another big question, but I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts, and anyone from the panel.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely agree with you that being a cognitive science, I've always been interdisciplinary, but I've been much more than that. I've been transdisciplinary. I've always tried to transcend academia. And that actually is largely Jakob's both fault and reason, namely that he pushed me from many years ago actually to try to understand what kind of questions do we ask when we are scientists, or what kind of questions should we ask when we are scientists? If I want to understand what it means to live with disability, it can never be that the only language I can use is the language that comes from disciplines predisposed already with answers. It must start from somewhere else, and that's trying to understand the lived experience of Jakob, or the lived experience of living with a disability. And for me, that I couldn't find my way in science, cognitive science, because I felt it was poor in many ways of language, categories, experimental processes. And so I joined Jakob on his journeys, and all of a sudden saw that actually when you start with what can be a lived experience from an individual, what actually slowly groups stuff together, whether it's neuroscience or it's an artist, we have done theater plays, documentary film, art installation. It joins each other. It becomes a unity around the lived experience. So if you start with an individual experience, like Molly has also raised her own lived experiences, it doesn't become that difficult actually to more or less collaborate with different disciplines, both within and without academia. And when you do that, because you always look at what is the experience Jakob is, for example, trying to describe or express, let's say the experience of being alienated, the experience of being different. And we all come together trying to understand with our point of view, me as a scientist. What actually it happens is that slowly it doesn't become just Jakob's lived experience. It becomes a lived experience of many people. And that slowly you see it goes from the individual level, then it goes up to maybe a group or organizational level. It can be an institutional level. And with many of the projects we have done, actually it becomes a political discourse. It becomes a discourse that started, or it has a root down into Jacob's lived experiences. And then art have given expression, science have given another expression, and technology a third one. So for me, it's figuring out, and it's always been starting with the lived experience and then building it up slowly, like maybe Lego. You build it up slowly with, sort of say, perspectives and aspects to that.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I've been using the term radical a lot, and I heard recently that the root of the word radical means to get to the root of something, actually means to get to the root of something. And I think that's what I love about what you just said and so much of this conversation, right? Scientists and artists at their best ask questions, right? Molly, I love that you said that you don't ever want to master your art form, right? It's a continual going process, like accessibility itself. There's no like sort of set thing that's going to be, concrete after a while. It's going to be this constantly evolving thing. And we are, I think if we're doing our job correctly as artists, as scientists, as collaborators, we are not necessarily searching for answers, but looking for ways to ask better questions, which will help us refine questions further down the line as we continue. So I think this is just I love how all of this came together and all of these different facets. And Daniel, I was wondering if you could speak. You are a multidisciplinary artist, as you said, and I'd love to get your thoughts on the matter that the question I posed to Christian, but also could you speak a little bit about how EnactLab came into this equation? Maybe start with that, and I can repeat the question if you need that, and that's helpful.
Sure. So EnactLab got connected to Molly and this opportunity to sort of be in conversation together through a relationship that we've built with Paola Prestini of National Sawdust over the course of the last 2 years. And that relationship itself came about as a result of asking these questions together. What does it look like to work together between art, between science, between lived experience? And that has given life to many different levels of collaboration with Paola. And so when this opportunity to work with Molly came up, it seemed like a perfect way to continue expanding those conversations and just broaden them with new voices and new relationships. So we're really excited to be a part of this. And yeah, I mean, Christian really eloquently sort of framed the way that we're thinking about these ideas. But I guess for me, the way that I've always thought about these things since I began working with EnactLab and even before is that each of these different things that we're talking about, I mean, we use lived experience as sort of the foundation and the fundament, but then each of these different perspectives, the scientific, the artistic, the practices, the tools that come with those are really just different approaches to understanding the world, different forms of knowledge, if you will. And so I think so much of what the way that we think about things is that artistic spaces, be they theater productions, performances, art installations, all the different ways that art manifests itself, they create really powerful rooms to be able to allow all of those different understandings and knowledges to kind of enter into conversation with one another in ways where, as Christian said, in the scientific community, even if you hop from discipline to discipline, the wrong word can decontextualize an entire idea. Whereas when you enter into this sort of artistic space together and there's an understanding that all languages and understandings and knowledges are sort of open, to be explored together, I think that is really how, as you were mentioning in terms of this idea of radical, that is how you get to the root of things, by using all of those different tools that art and science and lived experience provide to collectively kind of dig deeper. So that for us is what's really exciting about using art, not just as the output, but art kind of as the gathering space to bring all these different ways of understanding together and seeing how we can deepen our understanding together, both at an individual level, but hopefully also for many different levels of folks out in the world and in society. So.
That's incredible. Thanks. Yeah. Again, maybe the question is very simply, not to be too reductive, but maybe the question is, what if? ... That seems to be like the starting point, which I really love. And you're talking about spaces, right? And people entering spaces, and particularly within the context of this conversation, right? What if a non-normative body or an atypical nervous system like enters a space? How does that change, even like molecularly, even to some extent. I'm not a scientist, Christian, forgive me, but disruption was something that came up. You know, we had a planning call yesterday, and that idea of disruption came up in that call. And Christian, full disclosure, we met about a year ago before the lockdown in person. Daniel, Jakob, myself, and Paola Prostini from National Sawdust. And you said something in that conversation that I have not been able to forget. I don't know if you'll remember, but maybe I can recount it to you poorly, and you can put your elegant spin on it. But you mentioned something that when human beings as a species encounter difference or the non-normatives, that they respond in a very utilitarian way. We are sort of hardwired to look at something that is new or unusual to us, right, and want to immediately fix it. Now, I don't know if you recall this at all, but I was just wondering if you could um, sort of tell the people who might be viewing this a little bit about that. And I'm curious about, I'd be interested to hear from you and others about how that might relate to non-normative bodies, disability in performance spaces, in cultural happenings, etc. But anyway, but why don't you start with the recap and then we can build from there.
Actually, that question, of course, it's there's many scientific theories of how we evolutionary develop as species, and how actually prejudice, categorization, presumptions, all these things, how it actually works cognitively. And even though it's actually, it can be for many people very, very unpleasant to be judged a lot and all these things, being alienated, actually it for evolutionary purpose makes sense sometimes. But actually the question that arose with all these things that made me start to think about why do we relate socially to each other like this, actually came from Jakob. That was the first question Jakob sort of raised when we started to collaborate this. Why do people always relate to me in that specific kind of way? And with that specific kind of way, what he meant, like being scared or being like on flight, or what's this or what's wrong, and typically also judgmentally ascribing a lot of things to Jakob, like he's mentally not sound, or there's something wrong, or he's uncontrollable, which experientially, and when you know Jakob, he's probably one of the most bright and intellectual beings you're ever going to meet. So what's going on here? And I started to play a lot with this, and we did a lot of the experimental work with that. But one thing you can definitely, it's not like in science, we don't have a hard facts, even though people think we have hard facts, we don't have them. But one thing we definitely found out is this: there are some fundamental, you can call instrumental ways to relate to something that is new, or that is uncertain, or that is scary. And that would always be like the going back, categorizing, boxing it in. This is what this is. And then you can start to relate behaviorally to it. And we have done a lot of experiments, both artistic and more classical lab experiments, social lab experiments, where this is very coming forth. Yeah, Jakob wants to add something to that.
But then I think our thing is a wild or baby, because when I hear money music or artwork, it art is good music, is good art, and I think that when you work with art and the beauty, the art can be a safe place for people or normal people, and when they are lured into the safe place of art, they can start to explore the disability and the abnormal, and therefore, if you see, when I hear Molly artwork. I hear a wonderful composer for first and foremost, and then I read about your educate and about your hands, but I am not so sad or frightened because you have because I can relate to the music that is universal. So I would rather finish around if that is making sense to you. And maybe you can read something.
Yeah. Yeah, so what it's an idea that Daniel also spoke to earlier on, namely this, that if you flip it around, and we've done that with Jakob's idea many times in the theater and art installations, saying that if we know we have these preconceptions of how a body is, how a person's normatively, both normally and normatively should behave, then when we meet somebody that's abnormal or different, we relate to it. But what Jacob is saying here is that that's where art can do, like, be a space for meeting. It's a space where you can sort of say, pull away all the conception of this is normal, or this is how you should be, this is the way we should listen to music, this is the way we should see people. You can tear that away and then sort of say, build up a new relation. And as Jacob says, that is exactly as I also experience from a very different perspective, actually, Molly's work. Jakob comes from his point. He can relate to some of the aspects that Molly and lived experiences Molly is experiencing. But I can also, even though I don't know maybe first from my first person experience what it means to be in a car accident or what it means to be born with cerebral palsy. So it becomes actually a space for gathering, a space for meeting, and a space where you can say we are not us and them, but we become a we.
Fantastic, thank you. Molly, we were just speaking about your work, and I just be curious if you had anything to add to this.
No, and of course I'm so flattered by Jakob's comments, and I feel like I have so many thoughts, but just adding that I think like we all
You've
have
got time. Go ahead.
like we all have a body, like there's no denying the body, and I believe I'm like blanking on the writer, or I don't, there might be Tobin Sievers with Disability Aesthetics. I think he starts talking about how there's like no denying the body in a way with any human. I think just trying to connect it all to that rather than able or disable. And for me, I know people talk about this a lot of times, how people want to be inspired by your disability or they want you to overcome it or something. And for me, it's been more about trying to meet it in the middle almost, or for what it offers. Not trying to be over the top positive or playing into the negative, but for like the kind of range of what it offers, which for me is like kind of infinitely generative too, in a way. And I definitely know what Jakob means about someone with like a shared physical experience. I feel like Drawn and I were talking a lot about that a lot when we were filming this new work. And I think it's just so interesting how, at least for myself too, I know I still have some ableism built in, or we were talking about how one of the sections is about overuse basically. And like I have a lot of pain in my right side sometimes from using it constantly. And how we're like so scared about losing our right side because we know it's like the last thing in a way, and it's still about this prejudice. Like even though we've done, I feel like so much work with disability studies and trying to counter our own leanings in a way, but there's still a kind of built in, and how do you counter that down? I don't have any immediate answer, but it's still, I feel like the work is just kind of constant in a way, in a good and exciting way too.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Again, you've been mentioning disability studies, or that sort of indirectly, but that is theory in a sense, right? Not to take anything away, or again be reductive about that. But I'm curious, like you actually then take that theory, and that's called praxis, isn't it? Where you take the theory and put it into the art or the work. And I'm curious about how, if you can speak a little bit, how maybe you've internalized that or interpreted that, and how that informs your work. Again, you said it so beautifully, disability as a creative source, which I think most people, again, view disability as a deficit or a hindrance, or something adversarial or negative, right? But as you said, it's still rooted in the body, even if that body is non-normative or atypical, right? It is an endless source of fuel, inspiration, ideas for all human beings. So just be curious how, again, maybe I get to the core question, taking the theory and putting it into your
Yes.
work. Because even with the way you literally play, right, comes through in a different way. And I imagine how your hand hits those keys and even the choice of instrument. Yeah. So anyway, I'll let you speak on it because you're the authority.
No, so much to say that I think immediately with disability studies are more like typical with that. I think, of course, it just changed my thinking, especially reading about the social model of disability or disability as a social construction along the same lines of race, gender, and more really, I think even like allowed me to start engaging with my hand more publicly to say. And some of that work also more directly influences like my, I guess, kind of public speaking. And that also goes into the lyrics I write in a way, especially with looking into acquiring disability. And I love asking like where the lost nerves of my hand went or something and where they are now. And that's more like, I guess, lyrical form. And I'd also say with disability kind of in music studies and specifically some scholars on virtuosity, such as David Vanderham, who writes on the social construction of virtuosity, and also Stefan Sunandan-Hanish, who writes on, I believe his quote is like, disability and vulnerability like virtuosity demand heightened forms of performance. And that like really hit home for me, because, and I don't want to interpret my own performances, but I felt like once I started performing on the organ more and more, like I was offering a different side of myself, and I was like, can't that be equally virtuous? But I still felt like, especially in music context, and even today as a composer, like performers always ask for a fast, impressive piece, like only one type of kind of virtuosity or performability, impressive performance, which actually I'm trying to like do more research on now, or proposing a doctoral proposal on like virtuosity from disability. So hopefully I have more answers in a couple of years or something, but that's kind of my main interest now.
That's great. Please keep us posted.
Yes.
And I look forward to hearing it, seeing it. Daniel, I just saw your head nodding quite a bit while Molly was speaking. I was just wondering if you had anything to chime in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just, what Molly's speaking to, especially this idea of virtuosity, it really resonates in terms of a lot of the conversations that we've had, in terms of thinking about the nature of aesthetics, the nature of access, and that seems to be almost like a fascinating culmination in some way of those ideas of even deconstructing what virtuosity is, that, again, just really feeds into so much of the conversations we have, and thinking about, as we've repeated throughout, Molly, your sentiment that disability is a creative source, and so that idea of deconstructing what virtuosity is, to say, look, this is the source of virtuosity, I think is really powerful, at least for me, sort of hearing the way you're reflecting on it. So I'm equally excited to see how that continues to manifest in your work.
And maybe that goes back to this idea of dismantling or disruption, right? And again, I think I heard you mention this, Molly, but there being inherent ableism in music, in classical music, and again, not to call out anybody or do anything like that, just to acknowledge that has come up in conversation, and that may be a reality for many people. But that disruption, and that, actually, I'd be curious to hear, well, from anybody, but maybe from Molly and Christian, your perspective on the sort of the fear of losing what is sort of known or set or standard when introduced with something new, unusual, or non-normative. So if you could speak on that, I'd just be curious to know your thoughts.
I'd definitely be curious about Christian's thoughts too, I think, because I think sometimes for me, like, I guess going back to my research proposal, and I'm not in a program yet, and I don't totally know what's going to happen, but I do think, like, say the ideal in 5 years, like I have forms of virtuosity I've researched from disability, and I think that can be more investigated through new creative work around a disability, whatever, such as my own or other practitioners. But how do you translate that to classical music performers in a way they're performing standard repertoire? I think my ideal outcome of the research would be like a kind of Alexander technique, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a alternative curricular offering in music schools and maybe across artistic disciplines.
Can you, for those people who may not be familiar, the best of your ability, can you explain what Alexander technique is?
Yeah, I don't know if I can. I've never taken a full class in it, so I don't know if I can totally explain, but at least in my undergrad too, it's an offered as a class that always like filled up super fast. And I believe it's more I don't know, Greg, you might be able to explain it better, but it's more like a performance technique really grounded in the body and kind of relaxation and breathing. Again, I've never taken a class.
Sure. From what I recall, I've done it. I think it's amazing. Jakob, I don't know, have you done any Alexander work? Yeah.
No, I have not, but when I hear you talking, the thing that hit me is that to have a disability is to be human. The most human thing is to be abnormal and therefore also have a disability. And my big dilemma with being an activist is that if you say that me and you can among one Academy Award or a big prize for being the first musical article with a disability who can be a good thing or a bad thing. And that is my big dilemma with this being. And I think because I'm disabled or I think because I am a good artist, a good artist with a disability, and I have not got the answer. I would love to hear you about it because that is one of the youngest being I think with a minority or a disability. Yeah, and
Should I just do a quick recap? Yeah, so what Jakob is raising here is just this of how do you conceptualize these things, also coming back to your question, Greg, and what you also said, Molly, with this, like if we want to deconstruct something or disrupt something or dismantle something, so then how do you build that up again? So because many of the things you end up with, as Jakob is saying, is like then he's an artist now, but is he then the artist with the disability? So what do you then build up? What do you construct from there when you have deconstructed everything? Because, and that's, if I were to answer your question earlier, building upon what Jakob just said, and that was what I was going to do anyhow, because this is, many of these ideas come from Jakob, is that Jakob taught me this, that most language is embodied. So there's an embodiment to language. So the way that Jakob always have had to describe lived experience from him has been to take words, take concepts, take ideas from able-bodied concepts and ideas, and then try to fit it into some sort of expression or description of his lived experience. And of course, let's deconstruct that. I totally agree, and all agree. But then what do you end up with? More or less of the same Lego bits and nuggets, and then you try to do it again. So what's else to do? And I think in that exact dilemma and problem, which Jakob also said he doesn't have the answer, I think that is where, for me, science many times have to say, help, we need some help. And that's where arts takes over.
Right, that's great. I love that. And again, I'm not saying burn it all down or anything, although I still have a bit of a, revolutionary streak in me perhaps. But again, I think what art does is it puts things in a frame and it allows for attention that is spectacular, right? And what it does is, particularly in terms of disability, is it people say representation matters, right? In all art forms, right? But it says I'm human, right? I'm part of the larger human narrative, right? Like Jakob is a father. You know, I happen to be a father myself, but I'm also many things: a son, a brother, a husband. You know, like I eat soup just like like everybody else. You know, like, but again, because there's something very through no fault of our own, right, dehumanizing potentially about disability. And I think what's great as artists is we have the choice to play on all of those different facets, right, of what our disability might mean to ourselves and to an audience. Because I remember there was a disabled playwright who once said that to be disabled is to always be on stage. Because you're always in relation to an audience, right? When you are out in public or just going through your daily life or whatever. So again, by putting it on stage or putting it in the frame of a cultural event or context, you're saying to an audience, look at me, right? And look at my full humanity, which I think is really great. If I can get back to Alexander for a second, because I think it is connected to what we were saying about deconstructing, right, and dismantling. What I know about him is that he was Australian. He was an elocutionist, and he traveled the country performing Shakespearean speeches, and he started to lose his voice, and he couldn't figure out why. And I think he also had some strokes, and he became disabled. So he slowly over time developed this technique, which was rooted in the body and rooted in alignment, right? Natural, healthy alignment. And basically investigated his body piece by piece. So he deconstructed and he dismantled his own body in a way through his investigation to figure out how to bring it back to a healthy, normative alignment, right? So I think that there might be more of a root there than you realize, Molly, in terms of your theory about Alexander for this type of work. So good on you.
No, it's super interesting.
Yeah. But that's my, Sparks Notes description of,
Hard to sum it up.
my knowledge of Alexander. Again, so we're talking about one interesting thing came up at the start of this conversation. Again, obviously you're a musician and a composer, Molly, and Jakob, I find it fascinating that you said the way you sort of hear your voice in your own head is as with no issue at all, right? And there is a musicality to your voice, Jakob. You know, it may not necessarily be a music that we are used to, right? But I'm just curious if that has ever come up in any of your conversations, or how you might view that, Jakob. Because what I love, we've been talking about, you even mentioned, Jakob, how music can, we all say, music can transcend, right? The arts can transcend, right? It works through our ears and on our brains, and it's vibratory, right? But speech is musical and has a musicality and has those vibrations. So I'm just curious, I guess from you, Jakob, and then from you, Molly, about how you view musicality. If you could talk on that a bit. Why don't we start with Jakob, and then Molly, we'll go from there.
I have got one thing to say. I would love to make a birthday music. No, I think that is a little bit weird for me to hold this multitask working it because a lot of my work is based in my body, so it's really hard for me because I use my whole body to communicate with mommy, because it's hard for me. But I mean, and then I think it's a little bit of what I'm saying, the context in what I'm saying, and the notion of having something to say, the urge to say a comment, the urge to say something, the urge to explain, the urge to have a voice it's really, really strong. And even though you don't understand everything, what I'm saying, I often hear that you can feed me, and that is also important when you are trying to communicate and have a voice breaking.
So the first point Jakobs was making was that he wanted to, it could be good to do a boy band with you, Greg, him and you. So, and the second point was
We'll talk names afterwards.
So the second point Jakob was making was actually that a lot of the understanding or the musicality to Jakob's voice is actually embodied in Jakob's being, and that's actually a huge problem also in our daily work together, that we have all these Teams and Zoom meetings, because it takes the context away. So there's a lot of lost in translation actually of Jakob's voice. But nonetheless, and that was his third and last point, is like, even though many things can be lost in the actual language and understanding of what Jakob's saying, he, and I can at least, and probably Daniel, all of us can have a testimony to that, is actually that we do feel the urge of Jakob wanting to express himself, wanting to have a voice, and wanting to say something. So I think there's levels of the musicality and meaning of Jakob's voice.
Thank you both. And Molly, we are short on time, so I just want to acknowledge that, but if we can literally give you the last word, perhaps.
On musicality in general, right? Or in relation to disability.
Yeah, I was just curious if your definition or how you think of musicality has changed, maybe because of your collaboration with these folks at Enact, or because of how you acquired disability, or if you could just speak on that.
Yeah, I think initially when I came into contact with like disability arts or aesthetics overall, where I felt like it kind of, in the best way possible, threw out a lot of my assumptions about what it means to be an artist in general, especially performer. I almost felt like, well, should I just throw away all my training or something? Like, and even my work can't even go to, it's not accessible for deaf or hard of hearing people. But I think more recently too, it's kind of come more full circle that I want to dig into my training even more. Maybe I'm too traditional, but like to try to make the best work possible and then make that accessible as well, if that makes sense. I think to not get rid of, how we're talking about, like, do you just burn down the foundation in a way or something, like to try to like play into that, but then to make the best work possible, really grounded in the disabled experience too.
Yeah, I think what's so lovely is you have your training is give you what you want to rebel against or lean into,
Yeah.
right, and support, right, which is really fantastic and lovely. So I think that's about all the time we have for today, but thank you all so much. It is lovely to see you all again. Molly, nice to finally meet you in person. Thank you for this very thrilling and scintillating conversation. I know we could talk for days on end about this probably, and I look forward to this conversation continuing with National Sawdust and others, and with each other. So thank you very much. Thank you to our interpreters, to National Sawdust, everyone who made this possible. Be well, stay safe, and hope to see you all in the real world soon.